If OCD was a movie based on how you've experienced it, what would it be called?
How about we start with wash, rinse, repeat. It's so helpful with OCD when you're able to separate the O's and the C's. Like I learned it with that in my 20s. I didn't need to get rid of the O's and I didn't need to get rid of the C's. I just need to break the link between them.
And you've done something different than what a lot of other people have done. You've broken the silence about mental health issues.
Just being able to say this out loud gives me some relief. It doesn't solve anything underneath it, but it's just like, I care a lot about destigmatizing mental health. I do think a cultural norm should be that a mental health issue is a medical issue, just like diabetes, just like cancer.
Welcome to another episode of the Get to Know OCD podcast. I'm thrilled to have Brad Feld here today. Thanks, Brad, for joining. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Patrick. Great to be here.
We always start with something fun. So if OCD was a movie based on how you've experienced it, what would it be called?
Well, I got a whole bunch of movie titles.
All right, I'm ready. Let's go.
How about we start with wash, rinse, repeat.
That's a good one. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Trapped in the house because of the number 3.
Ooh. All right.
Never clean enough. Can't make my way down the street without straightening everything.
Okay.
And that's not really a movie title, but more like a reality.
I like that as a book, maybe.
That's probably
yeah. That's more of a book title. Of course, all those relate to some of the compulsions and various things you were doing. And believe me, you tell me where you're willing to go today.
I'll go anywhere, don't worry.
Okay. What were some of the underlying obsessions that were coming with that?
Well, they ranged. At the time that I was diagnosed with OCD, which was about 35 years ago, so I was in my mid-20s, early to mid-20s, I was running my first company. And so a bunch of the obsessions would be about dynamics around my first company, where I was trying to control against a negative outcome. Right? If I don't do these things 3 times, I'll lose a client.
Okay.
If I don't, do this if I don't shut my computer down a certain way, my hard disk will crash and I'll lose, there was like a bucket of that. I started therapy after I'd gotten divorced from my first wife, who was my high school girlfriend. And so there was like a whole set of things that were around that too. And it was sort of in that time period where, like, if I don't do these things, if I don't do these compulsions, then obsession, negative something around relationship, sex, sexual health, like really consumes a lot of emotional energy.
Of course.
That's sort of like, third rail kind of stuff. Like, I don't be thinking about that all day long.
Yeah.
And then the last would be sort of tragic things. Like, if I don't do, again, compulsions, my mother will die.
Sure.
Right. So stuff that I probably hadn't worked through in terms of my own underlying fears, but they weren't like contained in those categories. But when I reflect back on them, those were probably the big categories.
Okay. To go from that, and around what age was that started?
It was somewhere between 23 and 25. I don't remember exactly what age. When I look back at it, it was definitely in my teenage years.
Okay.
So I could, as I talk today to my wife Amy and sort of reflect on these sorts of things, like, it was definitely going on when I was a teenager. There was no real space to understand or acknowledge it.
Yeah.
College was really intense. I went to MIT and I was there for not just an undergraduate degree, but longer. And the intensity of that, I think, in a lot of ways, crowded out a lot of the obsessions, but not the compulsions.
Sure.
So a lot of my behavior had the compulsion characteristics to it, but I wasn't as conscious of all the obsessive thinking. But again, when I think back to certain episodic moments, it was absolutely there. Like, it was another process going on in my brain when these things were happening, and I didn't really have space for it until this period of time. 3 things happened at the same time. I split up with my first wife. I dropped out of a PhD program, and my company was doing well, but I was very bored.
Okay.
And those 3 things, combined with what I would identify today, looking backwards, as just being physiologically exhausted,
Sure.
eventually tipped me into a very deep depression. So I had this depressive episode that was undeniable. Like it wasn't a couple of days, a couple of weeks kind of thing. It was just deep, dark, bad depression. And that was the point where, I probably had enough, maybe motivation was the word, or enough pain, enough misery, that eventually it became clear in that time period that I needed to go do something, get some help.
And of course, depression comes along with OCD. I mean, not uncommon. If OCD is going to attack the things that you love and enjoy, and depression can be defined as a loss of interest or pleasure in things, you're no longer engaging in those things you love and enjoy because OCD is probably really interfering in them. So was it kind of like that for you, where they dovetailed into each other?
Yeah, hugely. And although I didn't know the OCD until after I knew the depression.
Sure.
I'd certainly had other depressive episodes prior to this mid-20s time period, but not in a way that were as acute. And the acuteness here, I've had a few at this level, and it's sort of longer than 3 months, where the defining characteristic of the depressive episode is the absence of joy. Literally the inability to see anything other than gray.
Sure.
Now, functionally, and I think this is why I didn't really notice it or have space for it until this really severe depressive episode, it's pretty functional.
Yeah.
I ran my business when I was depressed. I got through school. I was okay.
Yeah.
But in this sort of extreme period of time, that complete absence of joy of anything, then put me in a place where I was really fortunate. I had two people in my world at that point. One was my PhD advisor, and the other was my then girlfriend, now wife, Amy, who both encouraged me to do therapy. And I resisted it at first, but I didn't resist it very hard because I didn't have much resistance in me. I'm like, fuck, whatever. All right, who cares? And so I started seeing a psychiatrist, and I got lucky, and we can talk about the dynamics of that at that time if we want, but it probably then still took 3 months while I'm in this deep depression. Like he was clear that his goal was to try to get me out of crisis. Like step one, get you out of crisis. Yeah. And then step two, figure out what's going on. Well, I was in crisis for at least 3 more months. But in that period of time, it started to be clear, even in a time period where OCD wasn't well known, that this linkage between the obsessive and compulsive stuff that was consuming so much of my energy was directly linked to the anxiety that I was feeling, which just the magnitude of it then was causing depression. So that was the linkage. Like OCD was at the end of the tail, but it's a big unlock. Like once we realized that, it's like, oh, that's the thing. Okay, it's not something else. Let's concentrate on that.
A lot to unpack there. And I think fascinating in the midst of all that, you're in school, you're in graduate school, you have your first wife, a divorce come through, you have a company. How do you balance all of that with all this going on?
Couldn't.
Yeah. And
I think that was part of the problem. And this is a recurring theme in my depressive episodes in my later years. I'm 58 now, right? So as I've had others through time, historically, I don't think I do this anymore. I think I've learned not to. I use the word physiologically. I would physiologically exhaust myself. It wasn't just physical. Yeah. And it wasn't just mental, but it was emotional, like the whole range of how I felt. You think of a good metaphor would be the tachometer in a car.
Sure.
Like if you had multiple tachometers, they were all in the red. Or if you had a metaphor I used in my 40s, I did a long arc of therapy in my 40s that I finished a couple of years ago. But we eventually got to the metaphor of a dashboard in a plane, but with blinking lights rather than dials.
Than the dials, okay.
And if all the lights are green, cool. And then like being able to, I start to identify when lights would be yellow. And one or two lights yellow, not big deal, but all of a sudden more lights yellow, problem, a couple red, blinking versus like being able to like have degrees of which of these different things are overwhelming me. Well, if I'm physically exhausted, there's answers to that. If I'm mentally exhausted, when I say answers, there's approaches you can take. And frankly, if I'm just emotionally exhausted, I've been dealing with too much stress, I've been dealing with too much change, too many things going on, or I just can't deal with the cascading layer of the other things. I've never been a person that solves those problems by drinking or drugs or acting out. Like, I think to my parents' credit, they scared my brother and I shitless about drugs when we were teenagers, so that was never a thing. I don't drink anymore. I've never really drank that much, mostly because I don't enjoy it and I don't enjoy what it does to me. Right, so like I didn't have those. And the acting out, I'm a go to sleep at 9 o'clock at night guy. I'm a work really hard. I don't like to party. I'm not, completely unable to have a social experience with anybody. And I've certainly had plenty of times in my past where I've had those, but that's not like centered to me. So I didn't have any releases that would hide this exhaustion.
Yeah.
And that was really at the core of it.
And I like what you said too, because there's a mental exhaustion too. And I don't think enough people talk about that experience. We think a lot about physically, but we can't see the mental exhaustion sometimes that people experience. And especially as things are running through your head all the time and you're depressed as well too. Yeah. How did you juggle all
Well,
that?
it's a really powerful thing that I talk to a lot of CEOs about, is that, especially high performing people in leadership roles, like you have a lot of capacity for a lot of complexity. People are in different places on the ambiguity spectrum where, they can handle a lot of ambiguity to a little. I happen to be able to handle a lot. Mm-hmm. But wherever you are on that particular spectrum, like you still can carry a lot of different things. Yeah. What I wasn't realizing with OCD early, and I think I didn't really probably realize this until into my 40s, so after those first cycles where I really started to understand how I needed to relate to my life to take care of myself so I could not get into these depressed places, is the OCD characteristics were consuming some percentage of my mental bandwidth.
Sure.
And the normal, I love the Daniel Kahneman System 1, System 2 stuff, right? The amount of your brain that's being consumed by System 2 most of the time, unless you're focusing on something, is very little. It's all System 1. It's all the impulsive reactive stuff versus like you're really using processing power that's substantial. Except, I think that OCD shit is consuming System 2 resources. It's not impulsive. It's like, all of a sudden, like you're having to do stuff with it. So it has this disproportionate amount of energy drain.
Yeah.
And so, if you think of all of the things you're trying to deal with in this context, and let's just use mentally as a Jenga tower of blocks, like all of a sudden somebody's taking a bunch of the blocks out of the middle of the thing really rapidly. I didn't recognize how much that was impacting me. I also didn't have the causality between physical fatigue and that. And an example of that is I used to travel 75% of the time, mostly US based, but all the time. I'd be, in a week, I'd be in 3 cities, meetings all the time. I'd come home on Friday. My joke Amy's joke to me was like the weekend was sort of patch me up and then send me back out there again.
Sure. Yeah.
And I thought, I had a superpower, which was sleep on airplanes. So I literally would like get in my seat. I would put a little eye mask on. I had a little special, red eye mask that I liked. Mm-hmm. And I never could lose that eye mask. I'd wash it. I'd keep it with me everywhere. And I put the eye mask on and I'd fall asleep. And I'd fall asleep with the chair rigid. I didn't have to pull the seat back or anything. And then I'd wake up when the wheels hit the ground. Mm-hmm. And I thought I was actually like, okay, cool, no problem. Like I can sleep, whatever. I had this ego image around being that guy that got up at 5 o'clock in the morning, no matter what time zone I'm in, no matter how late I stayed up the night before. And I sort of rationalized it on, I had all this sleep time on planes. It was terrible sleep.
Of course.
It was of no value. We're investors in a company called Whoop, and I wear my Whoop all the time, and I care a lot about my sleep. If I had my Whoop back then, like I would be like, what am I talking about? Yeah. And what would happen would be that I would need a complete reset because of that emotional and physical exhaustion that I get to. And that reset for many years, I would talk about as I'm just exhausted, I need a break, I need a week off, I need 2 weeks off. When I look back on it, it was mostly characteristics of short-term depression. It wasn't just that I was exhausted, but I'd shifted into this mode where I just didn't care about anything. So when you say, how did I balance it? The answer is poorly.
Poorly, yeah.
For a very long time.
Yeah.
Maybe the answer today is how do I balance it today, and the way I deal with it. I mean, the first part of it was it's so helpful with OCD when you're able to separate the O's and the C's. Like I learned it with that in my 20s. I didn't need to get rid of the O's and I didn't need to get rid of the C's. I just need to break the link between them. Mm-hmm. And it took about a year, and it wasn't called what it is today, but the behavior was the same, which was I was instructed that whenever I was having obsessive thoughts that were leading to compulsive behavior, and I realized that I was having the compulsive behavior, I had to immediately stop. And that was excruciating.
Yeah.
My magic number was 3. So to get out of the house in the morning, I had to jiggle the door 3 times.
Okay, there's your movie title. Yeah.
There you go. Trapped in the house by number 3. If I didn't do it 3 times, I had to do it 9 times.
Multiple.
3 times 3.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
If I didn't do it 9 times, I had to do it 27 times.
Times 3.
If you have to do something 27 times, you're going to get it right, because you don't want to have to do it 81 times.
Right.
Right? Like, it was so pernicious. And when I realized that breakage had to happen, it did take quite a while before it started to become routine to decouple them, and then eventually the link just sort of vanished.
Yeah.
That notwithstanding, the obsessive thoughts when I have anxiety still spin up, or the compulsive behaviors. And the compulsive behaviors are fascinating. So I have one, I'll just give a couple that are contemporary ones that Amy, my wife, calls out all the time, and she says some version of what are you thinking about. One of them is this,
Okay.
right? So like I can't just straighten my glasses.
Right.
I sort of like tap them to get them straight.
Gotcha. Okay.
I have a thing I do with my toes. And so if I'm like laying on the couch and doing something with my toes a certain way. Now the 3's not in there. I'm not counting anymore, right? Because I've separated that stuff.
Sure.
But I'm still doing that compulsive behavior that's signaling that I'm anxious about something.
Okay.
So yeah, the catalog of these is long.
Yeah.
Somebody that has, as much intimacy with me as Amy is probably even more aware of the ones I have than I am. But it's very interesting to now be able to think about for me at least, the compulsions being more of the driver of anxiety, or a signal of anxiety than the obsessions.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
So my brain's not using a bunch of energy up when I'm anxious. My body's sort of unconsciously responding in a way, but that then again points to that signal.
Yeah.
Like something's wrong, something's not right in the way the balance works. And so being able to listen to that has really been helpful to me.
So I get this all the time. I do a webinar every Wednesday, and almost every week I get this question: why does it feel so real? How has that been for you through not being treated to getting treatment? Has there been a morph in that about how real the obsessions feel to you?
Yeah, there for sure. And today, when I have obsessive thoughts at this stage, at 58, I use a very simple meditation technique, which is when I have an obsessive thought, I just label it.
Okay.
So, I acknowledge its existence. I don't try to do anything about it. I don't try to fix it. I don't try to react to it. I don't try to control it. I just acknowledge it. Yeah. And so that's my tool for it. And generally speaking, it just goes away.
Yeah.
Occasionally it'll come back. And if an obsessive thought that has something to do with something going on comes back multiple times, I'm like, okay, I got to go do something. And it's not always the thing that is being triggered by the obsessive thought. It's like you need to slow down and understand why your brain is putting this picture up there.
Sure.
In the same way, the compulsive behavior, it's like, hey, think for a second about what's bothering you that's causing you to do this. When I was younger, the movie in my head was the movie.
Yeah.
Like,
right.
And I had I was working 100 hours a week, and I was exhausted, and I wasn't getting good sleep, and all this, and my physiology was changing faster because I was younger, and whatever. In my late 50s, like the movie in my head is not the movie anymore.
Yeah.
Like, and a lot of the movie in my head is just amusing.
Yeah.
And I've been able to get to that place where I can look at it and say,
Good.
"You're fucking kidding me that you're thinking about that, really?"
Good.
And so I try to have that relationship with the obsessive thinking, except for when it comes back a couple of times.
Yeah.
Again, back to that, which then is really more a prompt for me to try to slow down.
Sure.
And think not analytically, not like write down your list of all the things that are bothering you, but just like, hey, what's going on? What's the thing that's really bothering me that's causing this often irrational obsession to pop to the forefront?
Through all this, you've developed companies, you're an investor in things, you have all of these things that are going on in your life, and you've done something different than what a lot of other people have done. You've broken the silence about mental health issues, and you've talked about it, and you've labeled it, and you've given speeches and books about these types of things, and your blogs talk about it. What led to you to decide to do something different than most other people were doing?
Probably a couple of things. My last major depression, where I would define that as at least 3 months, happened in 2013.
Okay.
And if you looked at my world from the outside, things were going great.
Sure.
Great relationship with my wife, Amy, loving where I lived in Boulder. My business, Foundry, was going great. The other company that I had started that I was very involved with, Techstars, was also going great. Like from that lens, like you're like, what's wrong with you?
Yeah.
And if you looked at, I like to describe 2012 for me was like a country music song. The one where, my dog died and then I crashed my car and then my house burned down, like that one. Like,
boom.
I had a series of mostly physical things.
Okay.
That linked to complete sort of just physical exhaustion. I was working extremely hard. I was traveling all the time. Another layer of exhaustion. I kind of refused to acknowledge how tired I was. Mm-hmm. And then I then did have I had a near-death experience in there, so I didn't process it emotionally. I had a bike accident that I got really lucky with how the accident played out, and you could like define another way the accident worked and I would have died. Yeah. Like no question. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ryan McIntyre, for saving my life by letting me crash my bike into your bike. And a couple of other things. Like I've talked about this country music song of the year a lot. And then I just went, I just fell apart.
Sure.
As I sort of worked through it, I was blogging daily. And I've been blogging since about 2004, 20 blogs a month, very personal. It wasn't like bullshit marketing blogs. Yeah, there were plenty of things where I promote my companies and stuff like that, but a lot of stuff that was more heartfelt, more real about the experiences I was having, about how I viewed entrepreneurship, suggestions, thoughts, a lot of thinking out loud. And I was thinking out loud a little bit on the margin about this. I wrote a blog post about, this was in the fall of 2012, I think, before I really sort of fell into this full-blown depression. And by the way, the health thing that was the climax of all of this was I had a kidney stone that was gigantic, which I never had a kidney stone. I had to have surgery for it. So like that was the end point of it that then defined it. But like before that, I was writing about, I'm in North Carolina at a board meeting and I just want to be home. Mm-hmm. And, you could see some of that. And when I realized I was depressed, I sort of had one of those like, all right, you've been talking openly about everything. And if you now don't talk about this, you're just bullshitting yourself. You're bullshitting anybody that's paying attention to you. So that was like one piece. Like, it wasn't authenticity. It was like, I don't want to create this other negative cycle. Like, okay, I have to pretend that I'm okay in this public persona of mine. I'm like, that's garbage. Why would I do that? The second thing that happened, a couple of entrepreneurs had committed suicide from depression in the preceding year. And there was, the sort of normal thing that happens when that happens in entrepreneurship. There's some articles about it and people talk about it and things like that. But it was like the curve was very short. Yeah. And then I have an extremely close friend, a guy named Jerry Colonna. We've been friends for a very long time. And Jerry was open about, with his own sort of friend group, about his own struggles with depression, his own attempted suicide. Jerry's very accomplished. And he had talked openly a little bit about this, but even in private environments, he'd become a coach and was having larger and larger groups. He was talking about mental health. And he and I talked about it some, and we're like, I don't think we used this language then, but we could go back, sort of recreate what it was. And it was some element of, let's just be public about this. Let's personalize it. Let's talk about our own experiences. And by talking about our own experiences, let's try to help destigmatize.
Great.
The issues around mental health. And it really became, like, for me, an internal mantra, not while I was depressed, but just over a long period of time, like, hey, this is hard, this entrepreneurship thing. Oh, by the way, life is hard, right? But for all of us, whether you're an investor, whether you're a founder, whether you're a senior executive, this shit's hard. Mm-hmm. It's scary, and there's lots of moments that are really challenging. And every successful company I've been involved in has had at least one near-death experience. And not like one almost sort of getting close, but like, you look at the thing and you're like, holy shit, like this could be a gone tomorrow if like we don't deal with some of these things. And I'd seen so many, peers, CEOs, executives, founders, friends who struggled mightily under the weight of these things, but didn't feel like there was space to talk about it. The cliche, show no weakness, or if you're a leader, you have to lead from the front, and all of those things, which when, let's talk about depression versus OCD. If you're depressed and you're trying to be functional in that context, you really are just creating a bigger barrier to getting out of the depressive episode. You're putting more pressure on yourself in that period of time, where the better thing, at least from my frame of reference, would be to try to relieve some of the pressure so that you can have some time for yourself to heal and get back to a healthier place. So he and I just started, talking about it in different ways, different levels. There was a Big Ink magazine article around that time that we were both in that somebody did a really good job with sort of talking about this problem. I talked about it very broadly within Techstars with the founding groups and the different accelerators and lots of talks I do. And it started from this frame of reference of, I just don't want to bullshit myself. Like, here's where I am. I could stop blogging for 6 months. And if somebody said, why'd you stop blogging? Well, I needed to take some time off, whatever. Or I could just say, this is what I'm going through. And then that became more interesting, because like, okay, what are the ways, for me, that maybe more interesting is an important part of it. For me, that kicked off another 7 years of 7-8 years of therapy. Yeah. Different therapist.
Sure.
Psychologist this time instead of psychiatrist, but still CBT. And I would describe it after I was in crisis when I started. I got out of crisis reasonably quickly, 4 or 5 months. And when I got out of crisis, I'm like, you know what, I'm gonna go to Planet Brad for 50 minutes every week. Like I'm in my late 40s. I don't really wanna have that be a part of my life for the next rest of my life. Maybe I'll have moments of that, but I want to get deeper. Like, what's going on behaviorally that's causing me to get back to these places? And there were a lot of things that came from that experience that I didn't say, and I learned this from my therapist in therapy, and therefore, but I could weave into sort of like, I need to change this about my behavior so that. And maybe the last comment on that, in this period of time where I was actively depressed, there were probably inbound from, multiple hundreds of people, but let's say probably 50 to 100 people, somewhere in there, of names that anybody listening would recognize.
Sure. Really
well-known, mostly entrepreneurs, mostly tech, some not, and some who have been very public. Paul English would be a good example. He actually wrote a book had Tracy Kidder wrote a book about him, and it sort of goes through his whole bipolar life experience. Very brave book that Paul did, great book that Tracy wrote, but that Paul allowed to be written. Dave Moran, who was early at Facebook, did a big thing with UCLA. That was a grand challenge around mental health. There were people that were doing these sorts of things that sort of were the ones that at this time came. But then a lot of other people who said, you're the first person I've ever talked about this. I've never even talked to my spouse about this. Yeah. I'm not even sure I want to talk to you about this. Can you promise me? I had one person send me an email saying, will you sign this NDA? And I said, I don't know what the NDA is about. I said, look, if you don't want to talk to me, it's totally fine, but trust, I'll send you a note that I won't share with anybody. Anything.
There you go.
Right, so that was very powerful to me, because it reinforced how pronounced the stigma was. And it wasn't to a person, But so many people said just being able to say this out loud
Yeah.
gives me some relief. Doesn't solve anything underneath it, but it's just like,
Yeah.
And some of those relationships, some of the conversations have continued as people have had their own ups and downs where they've reached out and said, hey, can I talk to you about this stuff? And I'm like, hey, I'm not your therapist, but happy to spend some time,
Sure.
being a friend.
From the end of a psychologist, thank you for being open about that, because it's so great to see people stepping up, and it's not just coming from someone who treats it. It's like, well, you're supposed to say those things, that's what you do, but from people who live it. I mean, that lived experience, and to show that, as I always say, OCD wants you to live its life, and you can live your life if you want to, right?
Sure.
Yeah, and you can get there. There's a misperception in the world that OCD can be a superpower, like it makes you better, it makes you more organized and everything. And can you help dispel that?
It's fucking horrible.
Yeah, thank you. So that's what I wanted to. Yeah.
I've heard that, and the ADHD thing is in the same category. I have ADHD. That's why I'm so good at multitasking and doing something. No, I think that there is, there's this weird. I'm trying to think of what the right cliche doesn't matter. There's this weird overlap with, I think it's probably hypomania and OCD, where and it's not just manic behavior, and it's not bipolar behavior. It's like, oh, I can really concentrate because I'm really like locked in on whatever this is. And when somebody says to me, I say, I'm OCD, I'm really organized. I'm like, no, you're not OCD. Being organized isn't OCD. But if you're really locked in, that's not OCD either, because what OCD is doing is it's actually doing the opposite. Like, it's consuming so much of your active brain power that you can't get locked in. Right. Now, you can be functional, you can get through stuff, but you're diminished, not enhanced. Yeah. And so, it became a shorthand. That was the word I was looking for. It became a shorthand for something that was like, I'm really OCD. I'm really organized. I've got my shit together. I have my list, my this, my that. I'm like, no. And then, you'll see in this sort of hypomania thing, which I think is an attribute, gets attributed to entrepreneurs. I think there's some efficacy or some validity around certain character types. By the way, I think there's lots of different character types, but it's this, like, I can work really intensely and really hard for some period of time, and then I kind of crash. And again, it's not mania, right? The sort of clinical definition of it, where, from my frame of reference at least, where it's like these extremes, but somehow it becomes like, and so I'm really good, again, at concentrating in these moments. And it's sort of where I can really work well for 24 hours. And somehow that got linked to OCD again. Like, I'm organizing my life around these periods of intense focus. Yeah. And it's missing that when you're struggling with OCD, you have to put so much more energy just to focus at a minimally acceptable level in the context you're in.
Yeah. And I've also rallied against the notion that OCD would be helpful to even get you through day-to-day life, where people will say, oh, if I just had a little OCD, wouldn't that be great?
Yeah, I don't know what that means. I mean, OCD for me, when I'm, now that I understand, the linkage between, I actually called them anxiety spikes. So again, this came from my period in my 40s with therapy. I would be able to identify, like, we all have normal anxiety.
Sure.
Our amygdala is a complicated thing. We all end up in fight or flight mode. Like, it always like, it's just a normal part of life. Like, that's not unique. That's not a disease. That's part of life. But when a certain event that has a certain amount of rational anxiety production, or the quantification of anxiety should be a certain level, and you end up at 10 times that level, like from 0 to 10 times that level, that's not normal. Like, that's not something else going on. And so I would see these situations that would create these anxiety spikes. I'm thinking of one in particular where, company that I got involved in that was having a pretty big company that was having some issues with leadership. And all of a sudden the issues with the CEO got very intense. And like, couldn't not think about it. And I couldn't not think about not just the issue, but then why am I doing this? How did I get myself involved in, like, all these other thoughts around the anxiety. Now, again, fortunately, I didn't have the O's and the C's linked together. If I don't deal with this, then this bad thing will happen. But it was the same kind of thing where, like, it's this extreme. And so anybody who says, like, that's an additive, like, that was not helpful to me. The thing that allowed me to work through that particular situation was, you're being irrational. Like, this is way over the top. What's the matter? You need a good night's sleep.
Yeah.
You need to go for a run, not a 40-mile run.
Yeah.
like you need to just sit quietly and read a book tonight instead of, like, compulsively finish your email. And it's interesting that I compulsively finish your email, where a lot of people say obsessively finish your email, right?
Yeah.
And sort of on the other side of it, when the spike comes down to a normal level, it's like, okay, you can process the problem. And I think that's part of the, if only I had a little, if the person stepped back and said, well, what are you trying to get from it? Well, I'm trying to be more organized. That's not OCD.
Yeah.
I'm trying to be more, obsessed about the problem. Okay, you can use obsessed in a good word, in a good way.
Yeah.
And I used to talk about, for a long time, I would talk about the difference between passion and obsession with entrepreneurs. Every entrepreneur can be passionate. Sorry, I shouldn't say it a different way. Many people can be passionate about something. I can be incredibly passionate about this plant. I can be incredibly passionate about this piece of paper. Passion is the easiest thing to fake, especially for an extrovert. It's incredibly hard to fake for an introvert, right? So when you're looking at entrepreneurs, if you're looking for passion, you're going to get fooled all the time by that strong salesperson or strong extrovert or whatever. In contrast, obsession is really hard to fake.
Yeah.
And the good version of obsession, I eventually stopped using that because of the negative connotation that comes from things like obsessive compulsive disorder. And instead I said, for an entrepreneur, what I'm looking for was that person put on planet Earth to work on this problem right now? That's what I want. That's what I mean when I talk about obsession.
Yeah.
And I try to, when people talk about if I just had some OCD, I try to use that or some version of that. Like, you're not talking about obsession and OCD. Let me explain what that really is. What you're talking about is you want purpose that allows you to singularly focus on a thing really intensely for an extended period of time. That's a different thing than OCD.
I'm going to go with that. So do you think part of your purpose being on Earth is to help others who have mental health issues to understand it, to see their potential and move beyond that and not see that as a barrier?
Yeah, I would change that.
Okay.
My language around it's a little different.
Sure.
I care a lot about destigmatizing mental health.
Okay.
About recognizing that most of us have some flavor. I won't say all, because then somebody will come up with a reason why all's not right.
Right.
Many, pick many instead. Like, have some flavor of mental health issue or dynamic or thing that inhibits our ability to have a full, rich existence. And it's not the same thing through your whole life, and it's not continuous. Like, it has a lot to do with a lot of different things. And it should be societally fine.
Yes.
That's part of things. In the same way, I mean, if you go back far enough in time, it was when I was a kid, I think, when cancer was still stigmatized. And if somebody had cancer, like, you didn't want to be near them. You didn't want to be in the same room as them. You couldn't talk about it. I was in college in the 80s, which was HIV and AIDS. And, for the first 3 or 4 years of that, like, don't touch the person that has HIV.
Right.
Don't be in the same room as the person with HIV. Even at the point where people understood, here are the only ways you're going to get it. You're not going to get it from shaking someone's hand. You're not going to get it from hugging someone. You're not going to get it from being in the same room as somebody that is HIV positive. And even having behavior with somebody, sexual behavior with somebody who's HIV positive, there are ways to make your risk of being cross-infected or infected almost zero.
Right.
Like, that just kept on for a long, long time. Like, why is mental health the same thing? Why is there an inhibitor? Oh, you're depressed. Oh, I can't talk about my depression. Oh, that person has this. Well, if you have that, many of the things that you struggle with, people can't even acknowledge they're struggling with because of the stigma.
Yes.
If the stigma was gone, they're like, my behavior here is not helping me.
Right.
And maybe I need to focus on that in me So if I can, anything I can do to help lower that is good. I don't say that that's my sole purpose on life. And if anything, there was a phase of time, probably 2013 to 2020, where I put much more energy into that, like as a priority energy. At this stage, it's not a priority energy for me. Being a resource, being available, being an example, doing things like this, I'm happy to do.
Awesome.
But I'm not searching, right? I'm not searching for more of that to do in my life to solve a fundamental problem.
There's, of course, your life experience, where you've gone, the companies you've worked at, the things you've accomplished. And there's someone who's going to be watching this now who's at the beginning phase of all of this. What's your advice to them?
Yeah. I wish, if I could travel back and be in my 20s, I wish I had spent more time in my 20s understanding myself.
Tell me more about it.
Even though I did this therapy for 4 or 5 years, and it was very helpful, especially around the context of understanding that what I was struggling with that was causing depression was OCD, and then learning how to deal with that. And I allowed myself to not go deeper on some fundamental things. A good metaphor for it is maybe after 5 years of therapy in my 40s and into my 50s, my therapist said to me on one of our sessions after 30 minutes, he asked me in this case if he could make an observation, which I had always told him, don't ask me to make an observation, just make the observation. But this time I think he wanted to make he would do that to make a sharper observation.
Make a point, yeah.
It made me listen. I said, of course. He says, okay, I want you to really hear this. He says, my observation of you is the last couple of months, all we're doing is moving dirt from one pile to another. He says, if you really want to get at the roots of some stuff now, you got to dig. And it was a real sit back. I'm like, not a fuck you moment or anything like that. I was like, okay, let me think about that. Yeah. Like, okay, I got a tree in the backyard, and we live in Aspen, and aspen trees are basically, the roots are the part of the tree.
Yeah,
right?
kind of one system.
It's one system. So you have all these trees everywhere, but it's one big root thing. So okay, I'll go to that metaphor. And he's basically saying, instead of looking at all those roots that you can actually see here, a lot of times you can't see them because they're in the ground. All you're doing is you're just taking a shovel with some dirt and just tossing it from one place to another. You're not really going below the surface of what your issue is. And he was dead on. It was really helpful then to turn it up, go another level or whatever the right metaphor is.
Take it to 11 maybe?
Take it to 11 or level up in the game. Okay. And it wasn't very hard to quickly identify some places to go dig, some places which didn't have any roots. It's like we dug over there for a while. It's like, nothing more. Let's fill that back in. But you'd hit a root and go holy shit, that's a thing that's been getting in my way for 30 fucking years.
Yeah.
And
bingo.
I wish I had done more of that in my 20s.
Okay.
Because I think I was so guided by external achievement for so long. Not that I was looking for accolades.
Yeah.
But the definition of what achievement was driving me. I had a lot of intrinsic motivation around that, right? My engine for doing that stuff was very strong. But yeah, there was always the approval. I wasn't an approval seeking, I want a gold star, pat on the head, whatever. Amy and I like to joke, my wife loves that kind of approval.
Okay.
She has a star chart and has 10 things each day, like flossing. And if she flosses, she gives herself a star.
There you go.
And so every couple of years, I buy her a whole bunch of rolls of little stars
Nice.
from Amazon in different colors. That's not me. I don't need that. But as I dug into the roots, of course, a big part of it is I'm doing this behavior not because I want to, but because I'm looking for, and go down the mother, the father, the parental, the whatever. Or I'm doing this because society has set this as an attribute that's positive, and so I need to keep moving towards that. The more is a good one. I never really cared that much about money. I was successful at a very young age. Before my first company, I wrote a piece of software and got paid a royalty and was getting, 4 and 5 figure checks each month for royalties on that software. So like the financial aspect of these things was not a driver, but like the idea, even when you're 25 and you now have more money than you actually know what to do with, like the societal definition of achievement of, okay, well, you have this much, but if you had this much, and you have this kind of car, but if you had that kind of car, and you have this house, but if you, like, being able to look at that and say, what do I care about really in that? And oh, by the way, there's nothing wrong with wanting more money or wanting a bigger house or whatever. But I didn't look at that stuff. Yeah. And I then didn't understand how to relate that back to how I was spending my time and what I was putting my energy into. Mm-hmm. Instead, I was just in this default mode of this very rapid flywheel that I'm very happy with the 15, 20 years of my life of that intense period. And it went longer. It's probably like, again, 58, probably 30 years of that level of intensity. Very happy with it. But I made a lot of choices that if I could time travel back and do that work, I would have made different choices. I would have done different things. I would have done them different ways. Yeah. Would I have been as successful? Don't know. Would I have had as satisfying a life? Don't know. But based on what I wanted, I understand now, yeah, and how I spend my time now, I think I would have made a bunch of different decisions. Maybe the last comment, if I could time travel back. I think in the 1980s and the 1990s, technology was super interesting and entrepreneurship was becoming a thing. And obviously at the end of the 90s, you had the internet bubble. I think what came out of that with the rapid acceleration of technology and many of the things that are woven into our infrastructure today in terms of immediacy, whether it's around social media or news or information flows or communication between people, so much of that is really unhealthy. And in the 80s and 90s, there was a different flavor of that, which was your phone ringing at home. Yeah. With, on Friday night at 7 o'clock, when you're on the East Coast with a business call from the West Coast. Mm-hmm. Or driving down the road before cell phones and stopping because you needed to call from a payphone and check into your office. But the friction was so high. Yeah. Like, oh, fuck, you know what? Never mind. Or I'm not going to answer. I'm going to the answer machine, get the phone. Mm-hmm. Like, you kind of, there are kind of ways to modulate it so it didn't consume. Yeah. By the late 90s, that modulation was gone because of the internet, but there was still friction, dial up or slow, whatever. Yeah. Today, the friction's completely gone. Instant. And the result is it's very hard for, I think, somebody that has grown up with that, somebody in their 20s, to understand just the absolute magnificence of completely turning that off. Yeah. And also the tools that you need as, somebody in their 50s to reinforce turning those things off. An example I give you is I use a tool in Gmail that locks my inbox at certain times. And so my inbox locks at 5 p.m. Mm-hmm. and doesn't unlock till 7. I can't unlock it. Now, I can look on my mobile phone if I need to. Yeah. But I can't go on my computer and do email between 5 at night and 7 in the morning. I can't read it. I could, if I had my computer open, I could send it. Same thing on the weekends. It locks Friday at 5 and doesn't unlock till Monday morning at 7. Wow. Okay. So, if I don't have that though, and I open my computer to do something on the web, and somehow I end up on that first tab that has my, and then, our ability, we can't modulate that stuff. I would tell somebody today, figure out ways to modulate that stuff, to give yourself time away from that dynamic. It's go outdoors and play. It's you don't need all of that interwoven, because I think it really is systemically unhealthy. Last comment on it, it's not social commentary or political commentary. Like, I watch, whether they're contemporaries of mine or whatever age, who can't modulate the inputs. Mm-hmm. And as a result, you have this continual wave of inputs where there's a well-known in finance +1 -5 rule. The +1, I don't know if it's in psychology too, but the +1 -5 rule is for, if you watch the stock market, every time you see the stock market go up, it's +1. Every time you see it go down, it's -5. Whether you're looking at an individual stock or you're looking at an index. So if you look at something 20 times throughout the day, and at the end of the day, it ends at the same price that it started, you're probably pretty negative because of the ups and downs that you saw throughout the day. You got a lot more, even if you got the equal number of ups and equal number of downs, you're 5 times more down. And it's the same kind of dynamic, is that the information flow that comes to us, even if you get an equal number of good news and bad news, you're going to feel much worse at the end of the day because of the cost of the bad news.
Yeah.
And I say news, the cost of the bad information or the negative information or the information that makes you anxious. I didn't learn this until my 40s. Like, this would be another example of just how much that was impacting me, how much anxiety I was getting. Didn't mean don't ever look at what's going on in the world, be a hermit or an aesthete or whatever, although there's lots of characteristics of that at this age that appeal to me. But it does say change your relationship with this stuff, because this stuff's just making you unhappy and anxious and not able to concentrate on the things that give you +1s.
And that leads into, and you've talked a lot of this already, so this is cool, but in terms of what would be better for companies today in dealing with mental health issues and everything, it sounds like you would say, program some of this stuff in to give some of these breaks.
Absolutely. I think there's a long range of things, and we, and when I say we, I mean my partners and I, encourage, and at different levels based on the partner, but I'll personalize it to me. I encourage all CEOs that I work with, and I would include founders in this, especially at earlier stage companies, or founders that are not the CEO but are still very powerfully active in their companies, to have a coach, which is very different than a therapist. But in the context of work, that coach can help enormously. I think every company should have, as part of its health plan, access to mental health services, and at the minimum, access to them in crisis situations, right? And in crisis situations, again, you have much better data than me, but generally speaking, my own experience, you can get through the crisis part in a couple of months. Not always, but it doesn't mean that you're out of whatever the issue is, but whatever that really, horrible, overwhelming crisis, like, it's a finite period before now, okay, I am, in a functional enough place that I can work on this stuff. I think every company should have, as part of their health plan, access to that. The crazy amount of stuff in the U.S. In how health plans deal with, insurance around mental health, silly.
Yes.
And there's a wide range of efficacy, and I don't think that it should just be check the box. Oh yeah, we have, you can have 5 counseling sessions, once a year that your insurance pays for. It's actually, well, what kind of counseling do you need? Is it your general practitioner has, a referral to somebody in their practice or within the hospital system that's a general therapist who's just trying to get you out of crisis, and, kind of after session 2, they're like, well, here are 3 different medicines I can give you that might, work. Like, that's different than, even 12 sessions where the person says, oh, you're OCD, let's work on these specific things, or you're bipolar, let's work on these specific things, or an evaluative process that's part of that to see what the hypothesis of what you are, and then put you in the right kind of program stream. It's so helpful. And some large companies have really good infrastructure around that, but I think in the entrepreneurial world, it's continues to be either very weak or very checkbox. It's not a priority. Yeah. I don't think that companies need to get to the place where everybody is emotionally available to everybody else all the time. Yeah. That's a cultural norm of the company. But I do think a cultural norm should be that a mental health issue is a medical issue, just like diabetes, just like cancer, just like, some things that are longer arc versus immediate, right? Yeah. I break my arm, yeah, there's a very clear protocol for what to do if I break my arm.
Yeah.
But I can have physical injuries that are much harder. And of course, our society is dealing with this to some degree post-COVID with people that
Sure.
have long-term, different, complicated, unknown, hard to predict issues as a result
Of course.
of the disease. And in a lot of cases, the default is more of I can't work or it becomes disability than it is having real treatment that is helpful.
I'll go back to our first question. What is the movie titles of your life post-therapy and having some recovery and distance away from depression and OCD?
I mean, my couple of quick ones. I Don't Give a Shit.
All right.
That's like
That's a good one.
It's like the biggest. I Just Want to Run.
Okay.
There's definitely a Leave Me the Fuck Alone. There's some version of Hey, if you need something, just call. Like, don't make it hard.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of a good movie title for that. Scarcely and Pleasantly Available.
There you go.
It's sort of shifted to this place. I like to believe I got 30 years in front of me.
Yeah.
Maybe I got a day in front of me. Like, it's indeterminate. I think that's one of the powerful things about life is you don't know when the lights go out. There is one way to deterministically decide when the lights go out.
Yeah.
I have fortunately not, even in all of the anxiety that I've had and struggles, I haven't had meaningful suicidal ideation. I have one that I talk about in the book I wrote with my wife, Amy, called Startup Life. And that was in my 20s. So that I've been fortunate in the context of that. But as I think about sort of whatever the rest of it is, I want to have time and space with the people that I care most about, doing things that are satisfying. I almost said interesting, but I think satisfying is more important.
I like that. Yeah.
And the hierarchy of the people I care most about are my wife Amy. I have a younger brother who I'm very close to, Daniel. My parents, my family, my business partners, the entrepreneurs I work with. It gets pretty thin from there.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, yeah. There's some people in that group that are intimates, like
Sure.
Jerry. That I don't have a working relationship with, but it's intimates. But that's not numbered in the thousands. It's numbered in the tens.
Yeah.
And I want to spend more of my time with that, knowing when I had my first company, I read a book that said 20% of everything is overhead. No matter what you do as a leader, you're going to basically waste 20% of your time on overhead. I kind of apply that to life. Like 20% of what you're going to do is just going to be stuff that, today the power went out in my house and I had to spend 30 minutes figuring out why our generator didn't kick on and calling Holy Cross Energy and saying, hey, is it our house or is it everywhere? That's just life. You got to deal with that stuff. And then you have these episodic moments of incredible intensity. Sell a company, somebody dies, serious health issue, functional change in environment, something outside your control that really impacts how you're living. Like that consumes time, but it's episodic. It's like it happens, you put your energy on it. It's the rest of the time that I put in this category. That's how I want to spend it.
Awesome. Well, Brad, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Patrick,
I really do appreciate it.
As I said at the beginning, my pleasure. Thank you for what you're doing. I think it's just awesome that there's a scaled, significant company that's really helping many people with OCD navigate their way through it.
It's an honor to do it, I'll tell you, for sure.
Cool.
So thank you. And thank you all for watching. If you're interested in seeing more about the Get to Know OCD podcast, check us out on the NOCD YouTube channel or go to where you enjoy your favorite podcasts and download from there. We'll see you again soon.